Sensitive communication. Though we may become frustrated in our attempts to communicate the truth, we are always to do so with grace and love. Here now is Gene Getz.
At this point in the story, we meet another man that walks on stage, and his name is Elihu. And like Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, he did not have a correct perspective on Job's suffering. But he knew something was wrong in relationship to the other three men and what they were saying. Now, he was a younger guy. In fact, he says in his statements that I was young, and because I'm young, I'm going to hold back. But in essence, what I'm hearing from these three guys is upsetting me and making me angry, so I just can't hold back anymore, and I'm going to say what I want to say. And that's what we're going to look at, just briefly, because there's a very extensive passage here from chapters 32 to 37, which is basically his speech. And once he began to talk, he really talked. But let's take a look at Job 32, verses 1 through 3. So, these three men quit answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. And there, the three men refer to the three men that we've met all along, and their speeches, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Now, basically, Elihu is listening in. And it appears that he's heard all of these statements. We read, Then Elihu became angry. He was angry at Job because he had justified himself rather than God. And we can evaluate basically that statement because his conclusions weren't totally accurate. In a sense, you're going to see that he thought he was justifying himself, but Job was really defending himself in a way that is understandable in view of what was happening. He was angry at Job because he had justified himself rather than God. He was also angry at Job's three friends because they had failed to refute him and yet had condemned him. And so we see Elihu coming forward and saying, I'm going to share my wisdom. I can't keep quiet anymore. And so notice, if you go to verses 3 and 4, he says, my words come from my upright heart. Now, immediately, I think there is a clue to who is upright here and who isn't. He's just criticized Job for justifying himself and being righteous before God, and he steps up and says, I've got an upright heart, so I'm entitled to speak. Immediately, I think that says, whoa, wait a minute here. There's a problem. Now, he's going to say some good things, but he doesn't have the right perspective. And already we see an element of arrogance. My words come from my upright heart, and my lips speak with sincerity what they know, as if Job was not sincere. As if the other guys were not sincere. Problem, I think, in terms of his own heart. And then he goes on to say, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Now, to me, that sounds a bit hypocritical. It's really fascinating that he goes on and on and on and on with his words. As I said, chapter 32 all the way to chapter 37. Solomon, I think, had a word for Elihu. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2, and I'll just read it for you. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. Let your words be few. And that certainly wasn't true of Elihu in this particular situation. Now, he was particularly disturbed with Job's what he called self-justification. And let me just share with you verses 8 to 11. And here's what he said. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I've heard these very words. And then he quotes Job. These are the words of Job. And he's giving these words back to him. He says, you said, I am pure without transgression. Well, I don't think Job particularly said that. He's not really quoting him accurately. I am clean and have no guilt. In a sense, he was saying, I've been living an upright life, so this is not fair. He did say that. But he, this is Job speaking, finds reason to oppose me. He regards me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He stands watch over my paths. And then his conclusion is here in chapter 33, verse 12. Notice Elihu's conclusion. But I tell you that you are wrong, Job. You are wrong in this matter, since God is greater than man. Now, the fact of the matter is, I don't think Job ever said that he was greater than God. So Elihu here does not have a correct perspective on the situation. I think James has a word for Elihu as well, who wrote later in the New Testament, my dearly loved brothers, understand this. Everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Now, if Elihu were here to justify himself, he might say, I was listening. I was listening to everything these guys said, and I really was slow to speak. I waited quite some time to speak, and my anger built over a process of time. But the fact of the matter is that as you read through his speech, he did not have a correct perspective any more than these other men. Some insights, yes, but still did not have a correct perspective. And so James would say, Elihu, you spoke too quickly. You spoke too much. And you shouldn't have got as angry as you got, because it wasn't justified in terms of the whole story. And James goes on to say, for man's anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. Now, the fact is, the principle that I want you to see from what is happening here, and let me just restate that, because we're talking about sensitive communication. And again, Elihu is not being sensitive. He's frustrated, he's angry, but he's not being sensitive. And so the principle that we gain, I think, from what's happening here is this. Though we may become frustrated in our attempts to communicate the truth, we're always to do so with grace and love. I think Elihu is trying to communicate the truth. He doesn't have perspective, and he certainly is angry, and he's not communicating in love. He's dealing with a man here. He's addressing a man who was devastated physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And yet, as you read through everything he said, you certainly do not see an element of sensitivity. Now, let's think about this. Let's try to put ourselves in Elihu's place. And that's kind of difficult. But we can assume that he heard everything. He admits that he's heard the dialogues. He's heard what these other men said. He's heard what Job has responded. So here's the question. Though Elihu seems to have had a much better perspective on Job's situation than his three friends, how could he have improved his communication? I think he did have a lot better perspective. And as you read through it, you'll see a better perspective. In fact, we'll look at some things he said that were true and accurate. But put yourself in his position. I tried to do that in the light of what I knew from the whole story. And it seems to me that in a case like this, Elihu could have said, now, Job, my dear friend, you're hurting so badly. And not one of us can understand what's going on here. We can't understand it. And we know from observation, we've known you for years, that you don't deserve this. In fact, Job, you've probably lived a better life than most of us have. After all, remember now, God said he was an upright man. God said that. And so, Elihu might have said, Job, you've lived an upright life. We've seen it. Now, Job, if you were dishonest, if you were evil, it would make sense, but you're an upright man. We've watched you in your relationship, your neighbors, your family, and all of these things. So, we don't understand it. In fact, as I've listened to this dialogue, I really appreciate what you've said in the midst of pain. And what are some of the things that Elihu could have reviewed? Well, he could have gone back to what he said in chapter 1, verse 21. When all of this happened to him, and he lost everything. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Praise the name of Yahweh. I think Elihu could have said, you know, Job, if that had happened to me, I'm not sure I could have said that. If he were humble, I think he might have said that. Rather than being angry and arrogant and trying to deal with this man. He could have gone back to what he said in chapter 2, verse 10, where his wife said, curse God and die. And Job responded, should we accept only good from God and not adversity? I mean, he's on an ash heap. He's lost everything. He's there now, he's got boils, and he's hurting. Didn't just lose his family. He's lost everything. Job, if my wife had said that to me, I'm not sure I could have responded the way you responded. I mean, that would be humility. I didn't see that in Elihu. He could have gone back to what he heard Job say in the midst of all this pain, but I know my living Redeemer, and he will stand in the dust at last. Job, that's an incredible statement in light of everything you've been through. Elihu could have said what Job said in chapter 23, verse 17. Yet I am not destroyed by the darkness, by the thick darkness that covers my face. Job, if this had happened to me, I'm not sure. I don't know what I would do in the midst of all the darkness that you're facing. He could have said what Job said in chapter 27, verse 3 and 4. As long as my breath is still in me and the breath from God remains in my nostrils, my lips will not speak unjustly, my tongue will not utter deceit. Job, I don't think I could have said that if I were in your state. Now, to me, that's sensitive communication, and I believe Elihu knew enough to be able to make those statements, to at least commend him for the positive things that he observed in his life and what was going on in his life. He could have also said, Job, I know you've got why questions about this. Why is all this happening? I've got the same questions. I don't know why it's happening. I want to help you figure it out. I'm here, but I don't understand it. I know you're frustrated. I know you're angry at Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. I'm angry at them too. I've been listening to what they're saying. But I don't want to be like them. I want to help you. Now, I think that we can actually recreate this in the light of how a person could have responded in the midst of trying to help this man, based on the fact that he's heard all of this dialogue and all of this information. You see, we can learn some tremendous things from the book of Job and sensitivity. So let me share the principle once again. Though we may become frustrated in our attempts to communicate the truth, we're always to do so with grace and love.